Hi, comic book fans. What follows is an interview that I have conducted with probably one of the most knowledgeable comic collectors in the world. He has been collecting comics for longer than me, so more than 50 years. In fact, more than 60 years. And he has met a lot of industry greats. He has some great stories to tell about comics and comic collecting. So many, in fact, that my interview with this gentleman went on for 2 hours. That's too long for anybody to watch the video for. So I have split the video down into four sections. First of all, you're going to see section one, which lasts about 32 minutes, in which the gentleman I am interviewing, called Stephen, um, talks about he talks about his origin story, how he first got into comics, and how that collecting has evolved over the years. So enjoy this part one of the interview, my interview with the comic collector's comic collector. Hi, comic book fans, and welcome to SuddenlyComics.com video. We have got a very special guest here today. Very excited. For me, this guy is the comic collector's comic collector. He's got an even more impressive collection of comics than my mate Alan from the Price Variants. Um, I believe he was a Overstreet Price Guide advisor. Maybe still is. He will tell us, I'm sure. Yeah, he's nodding. And he goes by many names. Okay, so but the new one is Warmonger. He also, yes, does a very good warmonger. He's also known on Instagram as Collecto6, and I strongly suggest you seek out his posts on Instagram. They are some of the best posts about comics that are on Instagram. I know him as Stephen. Stephen, would you like to? I've introduced you. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us your origin story?
All right, fair enough. I it was a cold and rainy night. No, uh, my family was in the hotel business. I was a third generation hotelier,
Mhm.
and on Sundays when we would go down to after church, we would go down to the Imperial, which was the hotel my father was at, uh, and we would have breakfast in our restaurant, and it was always really packed, very crowded. So what Dad would let us do is we had a newsstand. So we were able to. He said, "Go ahead and pick out a comic book," and then we would have something to read while we were waiting for the food to come, which was nice of him. So that's where I got um, my Amazing Spider-Man #1, my Journey into Mystery '83, and I'm a bit older than our host. Mark is I think 6 years my younger.
I think that's
Uh, and having those extra 6 years, I was young enough that I actually picked up. I was in a position because in '62, '63, I was 9 and 10,
wow.
uh, and and so which was prime for comic book stuff.
Yeah.
Um, the one that I remember very vividly, other than those two, was World's Finest, and I have a copy, but I'm not going to dig it out. But it's the one with Mr. Mxyzptlk and Batmite on the cover,
Oh, yeah.
and where they meet for the first time. And it was at a time when the comic book code was very strong. This is like 1960, 61.
Yeah.
And so the whole type of comics that I had growing up were very pasteurized, very homogenized. And there are some people who sort of look askance at the Silver Age in the early stages because they say, well, uh, they had all their teeth pulled out. But there was, of course, growing up, didn't know any of this. I just enjoyed the comics, and so my very first love in comics was Adventure Comics. When my parents moved into their house up in the in the West Hills of Portland, Oregon, um, the whole neighborhood was collecting Adventure Comics for the Legion of Superheroes.
Okay.
And they basically opened my eyes to that. That was 1960. And so I instantly fell in love with the Legion. For, the Fantastic Four didn't even arrive until 61. So it was nothing but DC Comics. We didn't have any of the Marvel monsters or any of that stuff. It was basically DC Comics. And that's what I grew up on. I shifted over to Flash when I became when I was actually exposed to him. So the Adventure Comics first, and then Flash, and then from there things sort of fanned out. When Marvel started, I think my first book I had was Fantastic Four #5,
Wow.
which was the Doctor Doom, and I greatly enjoyed watching Ben Grimm as the Thing, being Blackbeard the pirate. And I read that book over and over and over and over and over again, and I loved it. I had three. I had the first Puppet Master. I had various and assorted. And I remember when I was a young kid, I had to go in for, I had a birth defect, not defect, but I had to get a hernia sewn up. And that was in about 1963 or so. And I remember my mother bringing me a stack of comics in the hospital. And one of them was L'Enfant Terrible, or Infant Terrible.
Yeah, another one.
That particular FF, I always associate that with being in the hospital. Just to give you some these sort of touchstones in my life, are basically, many of them are defined by comic books. They are how I learned to read. I think one of the first words I learned, Mark, was I knew that with DC Comics it was invulnerable, and in Marvel Comics it was always ironic, because the anthologies were always about when they had the superheroes starting into them. You got one superhero story, then you got a Jack Kirby story, and then you got either a Dick Ayers or a God help you, Larry Lieber story, or Don Heck, or Ditko, or whoever you would get in these anthologies. I really hated Larry Lieber. I never knew he was Stan's brother.
Yeah.
But I just really didn't care for his art at all. But Kirby and Ditko definitely very much resonated with me, because such distinctive artwork. But I was used to Kurt Swan,
Yeah.
and I was used to Carmen Infantino.
Yeah.
And so when I would make my comparisons, and also Gil Kane, but I also liked, for example, when I collected the Atom, I loved the Atom because Gil Kane has the ability to translate motion very, very well. But his inking is really not all that good. And so when he had an inker, his inker was Murphy Anderson, who is probably one of the best inkers there is in the business. Murphy Anderson's art, like on Hawkman, was very, very much like a portrait. I mean, it was like, they're very beautiful portraits. Gil Kane would make the Atom, would show him more in motion. And that action, that motion with Murphy Anderson's inks on him, on his pencils and inks, were so good. Just so the Atom to me is really one of my favorite titles because of the way the layout and how it works. I collected from so about 59 to 60, right up until about 1965.
Yeah.
And my mother got after me because I had quite a few comics by that time. And in our living room, I would leave them in little stacks on tables and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was absolutely genetically predisposed to not like clutter. She could not stand. Now, some of my buddies' mothers still would not let their kids have superhero books. They could have Archie, they could have Dell, they could have Classics Illustrated or whatever, but they could not have superheroes because it was a bleed over from the Seduction of the Innocent and the hearings that they had in the mid 50s, which basically promulgated the comics code authority. Well, with that in mind, so when guys would come over, we'd everybody show your stuff, and they always, when they see my comics, they would just go crazy because they had, they said, "Oh, I don't get to have any of these. Oh, they're so great." And but my mother had no problem at all with comics, but clutter she did. So what I did, I said, "Okay, Mom," and so I took them, I organized them alphanumerically, chronologically, and then I put them in. Our house was a 1929 house, and it had basically a cooler by the front door. There was a metal mesh, and then there was a screen. And so, like, if you wanted to put vegetables or potatoes or whatever, you could store them there. And so there was a clean, open shelf, and I put all my books, a big stack, about, I don't know, about a short box worth, actually,
Yeah.
a little bit better than a short box.
Yeah.
And these are all the books I collected from 50, and I took good care of my books. I never was rough with my books at all. Just as a side, even though I was careful, my Fantastic Four #5, it Marvel chipped all by itself. It delaminated, Mark. It delaminated by itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just sitting there, I would pick it up and pieces would flutter off. The Puppet Master was not so bad, and that one with Reed Richards grimacing, I think it's 13 or 14 or something,
Yeah.
where he's grimacing on the cover when he's swapped places with Doctor Doom or whatever.
Yeah.
That one had a couple, but the 5 FF5, it was cheese. The whole right edge was just.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just said, what that I didn't understand what was happening. The DC books didn't do that. The DC books were made of higher quality material. Well, anyway, so and they are. One of my favorite books was The Secret Origins, the very first Secret Origins annual, the big 96 pager that has the purple and the big logo and all that stuff, all the origins. I love that book, and I would read it a lot because I really enjoyed it. So a few days passed, and I came home from school, and on the way home, I'm thinking, I'm definitely going to read that book. And I went to the cooler, I opened up the door, and all my books were gone. And I said, "Hey, Mom, where'd you put my books?" She said, "Your comics?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought you didn't want them." I said, "Mom, you asked me to pick them up and put them away. I put them in the cupboard out from under your feet." She said, "Oh, I thought you didn't want them anymore." I said, "Oh, God. Where, what did you do with them?" She said, "Why, I put them in the garbage." I said, "Okay, can I go get," she said, I said, "Is the garbage still there?" She said, "No, the garbage man came this morning."
Oh,
And I went,
I mean, how much were they worth today? If you kept those in good condition, was that £1 million in the garbage?
well, it was a substantial sum of money because it was all from 59 up to 64. And so it was beginning of 65, this happened. So all of that really early stuff just got thrown away. That's my mom threw my books away. She never threw one away again.
Same happened to me. I collected the Beano and Dandy annuals, so I used to get them every year for Christmas, and I had all of them from aged about 6 up to aged about 18, and I had them all in my bedroom. And I came home from university one day, and I said, "Where are my annuals?" And my mum said, "Oh, I've given them to the local school fete."
Why would she do that?
I mean, I said, "But they're mine. They're not yours. They're mine. What are you doing?" Anyway,
What did she say? Oh, she was sorry, of course.
no. She just said, "Oh, I don't think that you don't read them anymore." I said, "I do actually still read them, and I collect them."
Oh, God.
Yeah, no, I wasn't happy.
So that's my mom threw my comics away. She was very sorry. She didn't really realize how it was, but after that, she never did again. The other one that really made an impression on me, that really set the hook in me for comics, was probably about 1959, 1960. We would always go to my dad's parents' house. My mom's dad died. Mom was from New Jersey, and her father died when she was only 16. And so my grandmother, my Nana on mom's side, she came out and lived with us in 1965. She moved back out of New Jersey. My mom's dad worked for Nabisco back in New Jersey.
Yeah.
But anyway, and Nana was a registered nurse, so that was how they were, and they were both 100% Swedish.
Oh,
And as a matter of fact, Nana came from Pennsylvania. Her maiden name was Holm, Holm. Her
okay.
name was Ebba.
Yeah.
And she had like 4 or 5 sisters. And because the elders had to stay and take care of the kids on the farm, Nana was able to go to nursing school at which she excelled. Nana was very smart. So she got the elder kids had to stay home and take care of the farm and all that other stuff. And on my dad's side, my grandfather, who I wrote a book about, was in the First World War. He was an ambulance driver in the First World War. And I wrote, I don't know if I've sent you that yet, Mark. I should send you the book. But the long and the short of it was, they were upstairs. Grandpa was a civil attorney for quite a number of years. And then he went into hospitality. And in 1943, he saved every dime he could, emptied piggy banks, everything to make the down payment on the Mallory Hotel. 8 bankers had tried to make this thing go, and they couldn't get it to go. The Mallory was named after Rufus Mallory, who was I think he was a Secretary of State or of Treasury. I can't remember which.
Was this in Portland, Stephen?
Oh yes, all still in Portland. My grandparents, my great grandfather was an upholsterer in Northwest Portland, but my dad basically went to Stanford and then to Cornell for a hotel. Grandpa bought the Mallory in 43, and then he bought the Imperial in 1950. And then when Dad graduated from Cornell, that's where he met my mom. Mom went to Skidmore, back in upstate New York, Saratoga Springs. And so then out they came, and that's how it happened. And then Dad went to work at the Imperial in 1950, and then Grandpa was in overall charge. I graduated from the University of Oregon in 1976. And then I went back to Cornell for nuts and bolts. And then I went to work at the hotel in 1977, early 77. My grandfather, and I had been working at the hotel already as a switchboard operator, houseman, busboy, front desk clerk.
Yes,
and then I was the front office manager to learn the ropes. So I knew what I was doing. But back to the basement. I went downstairs and I'm riffling around. My grandmother always would do art projects, and it was styrofoam and tinsel and elves and stuff like that. It was she enjoyed doing it, and as little kids it was fun. In one of the boxes she had separating whatever the guck she had was the cardboard cover to World's Finest Comics #6.
Right. Yeah.
And and even at that point I said, whoa, what is this? Because I'm looking at code books, I'm looking at Mr. Mxyzptlk, and here I am looking at a Superman, Batman, and Robin shaking hands with service people, World War II.
Yeah.
And so I spent the next hour and a half trying to find that thing, and of course didn't find it. But that set a hook in me. So fast forward to 1988, I started collecting. Then from 1965 into 66. All the way through 1988, I was a completist collector like Alan. I had runs of Tales of Suspense, Strange Tales, Justice League, Showcase, Flash, Green Lantern, Atom, Hawkman, Sea Devils, My Greatest Adventure, Doom Patrol. I mean, you name it. I really had it extensive. My floor grape was about VG Fine, because I couldn't afford anything more.
Okay.
But it was extremely comprehensive. And so in 1988, a dealer, the pendulum had swung away from Golden Age, and that everyone wanted Silver Age.
Yeah.
And so he made me, he says, I recommend that you consider not buying any more books, modern books, and you've got all this silver, and I want to show you some different books. So he showed me Golden Age books, and he showed me some Schomburg covers, which he had a whole bunch. And then he showed me various and assorted other covers, Schomburg's from Standard Needor and stuff. And my eyes got real big. I said, wow. And he says, I will make you a very favorable, a favorable offer for your books. And so I said, well, what are we talking about here? And so he gave me a credit of $32,000 in 1988.
That's a lot of money in 1988.
It's a lot of money now. So I basically then, my entire collection went away, except for World's Finest. I kept my World's Finest,
Right.
my Silver Age World's Finest. I couldn't get rid of those.
Yeah.
So of all the ones to keep. Anyway, so then the very first thing I got, he had gotten in, I think, 4 or 5 collections of Golden Age books in which there were different hunks and parts and runs, some duplications of World's Finest, from World's Best #1 on up to about 60 or so. And so he says, are you interested in World's Finest? Because I've got this set here. And I said, oh God, yes. So then I was looking at him, and I went right to issue number 6 so I could finally see what was inside, what's in this book. So that was what I started with in 1988. And then I started collecting Schomburg, and I was collecting Schomburg from 88 up to 96. I was fixated on him, and many of the books I got from, his name was Mark Wilson, and I got them from him. And then in 1995, actually in the mid 90s, I discovered I took the challenge of trying to determine the first appearance of the Sandman, and whether it was in New York World's Fair Comics of 1939, which people didn't know if it was or wasn't, or Adventure Comics #40, which is the first cover that has the Sandman. And the Sandman's a cool mystery man character.
Yeah.
He was definitely second tier.
Yeah.
But he was very popular in DC, and so I proved it. There was no internet. There was none of that. It was all by mail, and it was by checks cashed. And I had to copyright office. The guy that was the editor of the book, his name was Vincent Sullivan. If you look him up, he was a very, very prominent editor. He was the editor of the Fair 39 book. I managed to track him down in upstate New York, and I actually talked to him on the phone.
Wow.
And so I spoke to him about it, and he said, yes, the Adventure Comics story, that book came out after Fair 39. All the stories in Fair 39 have to do with obviously the 1939 World's Fair.
Yeah.
And I determined and then at about that time, the first Gerber Journal was published and distributed. And it came in 2 chunks. The first part you got, and then you waited, and then the second part came. And when the first part came, it had the dust covers for both volumes and a slipcase for it. A cardboard case for it. And then the second one came, and then you put the dust covers on them, and there you had it. The majority, if not all, of the Gerber photojournals are the Mile High collection of comics.
Yeah.
And so, because Ernie Gerber and his wife, when he traveled the world to get the best copies he could take pictures of, and so the Church collection was collected by Edgar Church, the Mile High collection in Colorado.
Yeah.
And he went to the same newsstand, and they all had the same. They have D delivery dates on them, and I was able to prove, because I looked at a more deliberate and careful collector of comic books you could not find than Edgar Church.
Right.
The best collection there ever was, or ever has been in comics. There's been a lot of fancy ones, but nothing like the Mile High collection. And so that was the one that started.
Edgar Church, his family didn't even appreciate what he was doing, did they? They didn't even know what he had.
No, and the fact was that he was basically he was trying to be an artist.
Yeah.
And so he was buying these books to try to figure out how to draw anatomy. He has paintings and stuff that he did, which were very mundane. which are probably still owned by Chuck Rosansky of Mile High Comics, who was one of the guys that discovered the collection. But I'm getting long-winded here, but edit away. But the best part of it was, at that point, because I proved it, and I sent a letter with all my findings to Don and Maggie Thompson's comic book newsletter, not comic book marketplace, but comic book guide. And it was a newspaper that came out. And that's how we used to buy books, is a newspaper would come out, you call them up, the dealers up, they would put the ads in, and you had to race like crazy to get to them first before the books would be sold, because it was first come, first serve. So, that's just the way it was back then. And so what happened was I got invited to become an advisor to the guide, because Bob resisted me. And I talked to him on the telephone. I said, Bob, I said, Fair 39, and I was so excited to share that with him. And he was about as disinterested as you can. I was amazed. He wasn't interested in it. And so finally I said, well, look, I said, why do you think that Adventure 40 is first? And he has a Southern drawl, and I'm going to imitate him, and it's perfect. So this is what he actually sounds like. He says, Steve, I looked at the story in Adventure 40. I look at the story in Fair 39, and the story, it's obvious that Adventure 40 came first. And I said, well, Bob, that may be, but it was not available to the public first. We're talking about first available to the public. Well, I talked to a friend of mine who remembers vividly buying Adventure 40, and then afterward, then buying Fair 39. And so I said, wait a minute, you're telling me some guy that you know bought a book off the newsstand, and I'm telling you that I talked to Vincent Sullivan. I have the copyright. I have the copyright office. I have the delivery dates from the Mile High collection. I have all of this, and you're telling me some guy that thinks that he remembers this? I said, here's the other thing, Bob. That first story, you could have put that into a desk and left it for 50 years. And it may have been the first drawn story. Okay, but it sure as hell wasn't the first one available for sale, was it? So he says, well, Steve, sure, think about that. So if you look in the price guide now, it says, first published appearance, see Adventure 40 for first drawn story. He couldn't let it go. So by virtue of that, they brought me back and made me an advisor to the comic book price guide in 1995. And that's where I met. And then I went in when Stephen Fischler of Metropolis, Richard Evans from Bedrock City Comics, Dave Alexander from David DTA Collectibles, Dan Greenalch Comics, Russ Cochran. I mean, all these guys, we all became advisors at the same time in 1995. And that was just the time when Steve Geppi had bought out Mr. Overstreet.
Right.
And so Geppi basically very, very kindly, he had just opened his Diamond International Gallery. It was incredible. And the paint was still wet. And he had gotten Bob's whole collection as part of the deal. He bought him out lock, stock, and barrel. And we went into the back. He says, would you guys like to look at some books? And of course, all of us said, absolutely. So he opened up the door to his inner office, and on the floor were framed pictures of every piece of original art for every one of the price guides, all of them.
Whoa.
Just lined up along the floor. And on the desk were stacks of books, and they were Mile Highs. And they were raw, just sitting on a desk, the stacks of Mile High books. And if you ever smelled a Mile High book, the newsprint and the paper and the ink, it's like it's brand new. It's like absolutely brand new. It smells, it's just so fresh.
The storage, he must have stored them in some form of perfect condition, or the climate was just right. Or
now what he did, and there's this, that they write about this in the guide. They've told this story many times. But what it was, Church had built cabinet, and the books were put in other words, standing up next to one another, very carefully spaced together, all around this in this huge cabinet. And it was in Colorado, where it's cold, dry, and dark.
Yeah.
And so he put them in there, and the storage conditions were absolutely perfect.
Perfect. Yeah.
And so and then they sat, and that was it. They sat,
Yeah.
and then they were discovered, and then all this the stuff. So anyway, when I met Dave Alexander, then he opened my eyes to Fox Features Syndicate and Kamen and Baker, Good Girl, and then he opened my eyes to Fiction House. And of course, the Iger House of Art was the packager for both of those companies. In other words, Victor Fox and Ned Pines, respectively. Victor Fox from Fox Features and Ned Pines, who was the big man for a lot of stuff, for Standard Needor, Fiction House, all those. That's Ned Pines. Basically, had them create the artwork, and then they packaged them, and then they sold them under their brand. Now, Fiction House and Fox Features Syndicate, the interior stories are wonderful. They're drawn beautifully by fantastic artists: Kamen, Baker, Feldstein, Maurice Whitman over in Lily Renee. They were all in the studio. Joe Doolin, Bob Lubers. I mean, and many, many more worked for the Iger House. So all of those stories, the covers were beautiful, but the interiors are beautiful too. Well, that was a wow. And then Dave found this collection called the Loon Collection, which was an older couple bought a house and all its contents. And in the garage, whoever the people were before, wherever it was filled with Golden Age comic books, Standard Needor and Fox. And they were in a state that just like the Mile Highs. It was cold, dry, and dark.
Yeah.
And so he says, "What do you think of these?" I said, "Oh my God." And so my first Planet that I bought from this Loon collection, the reason I call them loons, these people were eccentric. And I've always felt that the wrong people get books.
I have heard of this collection. Yeah. Yeah. I think
And, and so anyway, my first book that I bought from Fiction House was Ghost Comics #2 with that Maurice Whitman cover. And the first Planet I bought was Planet 35, which was a Lily Renee cover, the green dress with her arms back and wonderful stuff. And anyway, and I stopped buying new books. I just basically was buying these Golden Age, and that's what I've been doing. And then I found out about 1998 to 2000, as I was collecting, the value of these books, the pendulum swung back over to Golden Age.
Yeah.
And pre-code stuff.
Yeah.
And what I ended up doing is I sold a few books and I made good money, but then I wanted to replace them. And what I found out was that even though I had the money and I had more money, I could not replace the books. Not only could I not replace them, if I did, I paid more than I paid. I would pay more than I made for my book, and I got a lesser book. And I did that a couple times, and I said, "That's it, brother. When I get a nice book, I'm holding on to it." And so my raison d'etre is that I would buy the best copy I could find and afford. And then I would relax, because this upgrade business is a bird. Because then you got to either hold on to the copy or make excuses to sell it or take a discount to try and get something out of it. And this way, then you do it once and you're done. And that's the way I approached it. So I would pass on it off. And by the way, in the 90s, it was a very target rich environment. But right now, I will tell you, the comic market right now is better than it has ever been